You're listening to The Conversation. It's September 2025, and 40 scientists are gathering in Sapporo in Japan. They come from all over the world, and over the next 5 days, they'll debate, analyse data, and eventually make a decision that will affect billions of people. Which strains of flu the world should vaccinate against. This isn't an easy decision. The scientists are trying to predict which viruses will be circulating 6 months in the future, in the southern hemisphere's flu season. If they get it right, vaccines will protect millions. If they get it wrong, the consequences could be severe. Europe and the US are heading into an influenza season that some are warning could be particularly severe this winter. While in Australia, even as summer approaches, there are still high numbers of cases after a record-breaking flu season.
Australia is battling its worst flu season on record, with 410,000 lab-confirmed cases so far this year.
So how does the process of deciding on a flu vaccine actually work? And how does what happens in the southern hemisphere influence what's going to happen in the northern hemisphere? I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, an independent news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. In this episode, how the world decides which flu strains to vaccinate against. I was in Melbourne in Australia recently, and while I was there, I went to visit Ian Barr. He's the Deputy Director for the World Health Organization's Collaborating Centre for Reference and Research on Influenza. He's based at the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity, which is part of the University of Melbourne. And he sits on the global panel which decides which strains of flu we get vaccinated against each year. He started by showing me around his lab. So, Ian, tell us where we are.
So this is our main working laboratory. So here we collect samples from all over the region, so from Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia and the subcontinent, and we bring them into the lab here and we analyse those viruses for their characteristics.
Can you show me around?
I can certainly show you around. Let's walk down the corridor. So this is walking through part of the laboratory here, so it's divided up into a number of different areas. There's 3 of the -80 freezers here on your right-hand side here. So we have about 20 of these -80 freezers because we need to keep the viruses at a very low temperature to retain their viability. So we have a cell culture facility. Viruses don't grow by themselves. They need to have cells to infect. So we have a range of mammalian cells here that grow in little tissue culture flasks, and we use those cells and we infect those cells with viruses or with clinical samples, and then we can analyse those viruses because they multiply a lot. So there's a lot of virus by the time the culture process is finished, which can take anywhere between 3 to 5 days.
And you're really looking for what strain everything is? Is that essentially one of the main things you're doing here?
Well, we look at more than just what strain it is. So influenza has 4 different types, A, B, C, D, and influenza A has 18 or 19, depending which ones you count, different subtypes. So we're looking at the subtypes there, and then we even look even closer down into those viruses to have a look at their genetic and antigenic characteristics. So we're in another room now, and this room is dedicated to growing the viruses.
Tell me what's in front of us.
So in front of us we have some biosafety cabinets. So this is where we do all our work to make sure that we don't get infected with the viruses and we don't contaminate any viruses we might grow up. So in these biohazard cabinets, we would have people working, and they would be taking clinical samples, putting them in with the cells, which we've taken from the other room, to try and isolate the viruses. So you can see some of our flasks here, and if we open an incubator, we can see what's being currently grown up. So each one of these small vessels contains a clinical sample or an isolate from another laboratory, which we then passage on.
So these are samples that people have given you part of a monitoring program?
Yeah. So we get them from all around the region.
Opening it up.
Opening up. Let's see where some of these samples have come from. Okay, so this is a sample we've got from Sydney. In fact, 3 samples from Sydney. So these would be from one of the laboratories that have already diagnosed this patient as being influenza positive. and then we will get those samples and do further analysis on them.
Okay.
So when you're looking at these culture vessels, after 3 to 5 days, you can tell that there's virus there because it kills the cells. So that usually is a pretty good indication. Then we go on and do further testing to confirm. The other way we look at viruses is their genetic characteristics. So we have specialised rooms here for looking at those viruses' genetic characteristics. So we do partial or full genome sequencing of the influenza virus. It's only a small genome, about 13,500 bases.
Okay.
So it's quite a small genome.
Compared to other viruses?
Compared to other viruses and compared to DNA viruses or human DNA.
So do you choose specific samples to do the genetic sequencing of?
So we do a selection of viruses for sequencing. Some laboratories do sequencing first, so they'll sequence all the viruses they've got. That's quite an expensive exercise. We prefer to do culture first and isolate the viruses and then select viruses for sequencing.
What's the advantage of doing a genetic sequence on a virus? What does it tell you that not doing one does?
Well, it tells you a lot. It tells you very subtle differences in the viruses. So if there's a new variant emerges, we can detect that if it's got some key amino acid changes in particular genes.
Where are we now?
So this is our post-PCR room and our research area for making reverse-engineered influenza viruses. So if we see a change in a virus that might be of interest or we want to investigate further, we can produce that virus synthetically. So we can do that in this room.
When you tell me we're in this room and you can synthetically sequence new variants in here.
Synthetically produce.
We're just walking in here. We haven't got any kit on. Why is that?
Nobody's doing any work here at the moment. So there's only one person here who's working on viruses, and she's doing a library preparation, which doesn't require any PPE. But if people were working on reverse engineered viruses, they'd be doing that sort of work in the biosafety cabinets behind you.
Do you guys ever get sick?
We never get sick. I haven't had a sick day in 20 years.
After our lab visit, I sat down with Ian Barr in his office to talk through how decisions about flu vaccines are made. So Ian, twice a year, scientists from around the world get together to decide what flu strain the world needs to vaccinate against. Can you take me to one of those meetings? What are they like?
Oh, I could take you to the most recent one. So we had a group of about 40 people fly into Sapporo in Hokkaido in Japan in September 2025, and we get together for 5 days. The first couple of days, we discuss the data, and we also have a look at what's happening in the zoonotic world. So it's not just human influenza that we look at, it's also animal influenza and the spillovers into humans. And then we have a process where we have to produce a document which outlines our thinking and any rationale about why we might have updated a vaccine strain. The decision is made by the WHO collaborating centres, essential regulatory laboratories. We have a group of modelers who attend and some other members of the group. And then on the Friday of that week, we get together with industry and explain what's happening and why we're making these recommendations. So the vaccine producers from all around the world are at that meeting to hear what their fate is in terms of having to change or not change their strains for the upcoming season.
And you essentially choose one strain, do you, for the world?
It used to be 4 strains, so there's 4 different types of influenza circulating up until 2020, and since 2023 we're now recommending 3 strains. So there's 3 different viruses which are selected.
You say there are 3 strains that you recommend vaccines for, but if we get a flu shot, we get 1 vaccine. So are we vaccinating people for all 3 in 1?
You are. You're getting 3 for the price of 1. I mean, it used to be 4 for the price of 1, but no, that's it. So you get 2 influenza A strains, the H1, H3, and 1 influenza B virus in that vaccine. So it's B Victoria lineage. It's the one that's going around now.
These meetings, these are influential decisions that really affect how different health systems around the world go on to vaccinate their people against flu.
So it's a WHO recommendation. Of course, different countries' regulatory authorities are well within their own rights to select their own viruses. Industry follows our lead, so if a country did want to do something different, then they would have to convince their local or international manufacturer to do something for them, which would be very irregular and may or may not be possible. So by default, it is a global recommendation for the Northern Hemisphere in February and for the Southern Hemisphere in September.
Is there ever any argy-bargy at these meetings? People disagreeing?
So of course, you put 40 humans in a room and ask them to make a decision. Of course, there's argy-bargy. You've got to realize that what we're working on here is a just-in-time vaccine. So we may not have all of the data. There's always a delay in getting samples from different countries to analyze. So we might not know what's happening in a particular country or a particular region for that matter. So it's very hard if you don't have the data to get a full picture on things. And because these viruses can emerge quite quickly, as we've seen in the latter part of our season here in Australia in 2025, viruses can emerge and grow rapidly and then expand globally in a matter of months. So it's always a difficult decision to make, especially when things are moving rapidly.
So what did happen at this last meeting?
So at the last meeting, we analysed all the data we had. It was a Southern Hemisphere decision, so clearly what's happening in the Southern Hemisphere can be more informative than what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere, but influenza is usually detected throughout the world all year round, especially in tropical regions, so they don't have as clear-cut seasons as we do in the temperate regions. So we analysed all of the data, and there were 2 changes made to the vaccine. So 2 out of the 3 strains were changed, one of them being a H1, which was just a bit of a catch-up because there's been a dominant virus there circulating globally for a number of months. So that was a fairly easy choice. And then the other one was a more difficult choice from the H3 component, where there are a number of different subgroups of influenza H3 circulating at the time. So we had to look at what was happening and what was emerging, what was growing, and what we might predict is going to happen in 6 or 7 months' time, because that's the time it takes to make the vaccine and get vaccines in arms in preparation for the Southern Hemisphere season, which usually starts about April, May in the following year. We ended up changing to an emerging virus, which has been quite evident here in Australia. Now we've got hindsight. Now we're in November, so it's much easier to make that call than it was in September when we had far fewer of these viruses. We made a reasonable choice, I think, given the data we had at that time.
So different parts of the world have their flu seasons at different times. In Europe, we're just coming into ours right now in our winter, but Australia's earlier in the year. How does what happens in one flu season influence the choice of vaccine in another region?
Look, I think we learn from what happens in each season. So what's happening here will potentially impact in the Northern Hemisphere, and we will then learn how things have gone in the Northern Hemisphere. In the February meeting, we'll have that extra data from the Northern Hemisphere winter season, or at least part of the winter season. It's just a continuous monitoring, continuous assessment of what's happening and what's likely to happen 6 or 8 months in advance. So it's a lot of crystal ball gazing and a lot of experience. And now we have modelling groups that use AI and machine learning to help us with these sort of predictions, but you can't beat experience.
So in the UK and Europe, when we talk about influenza, we often reference what's happened in Australia earlier in the year. Is that just misleading to do that?
Look, I think some years you'll probably be right. This year, 2025, you might be right. Other years, I think it's less clear that the viruses are coming from south to north, and they may come from other places that have had unseasonal outbreaks during the summer or autumn seasons, and they may spread through different parts and different countries.
The reporting in Europe right now is that we're being predicted one of the worst flu seasons in a long time. Would you agree with that?
It's very hard to make these predictions. It's just better to be prepared that you might be having a more severe season, but making predictions on severity of seasons, that's trying to win Taslotto.
Well, how bad was the Australian one kind of historically?
Yeah, Australia had a record year this year. If you replicated what we saw in Australia with H1 and also H3 circulating, then you're likely to have a bigger season than usual. How severe that is remains to be seen.
So this strain in the H3 virus, that was identified in June, is that right?
We saw the first cases in July, and we saw numbers starting to increase in August and September.
So then that would have been an influence in the decisions you made in September, which will really only come into the jabs that get into our arms in the first part of next year. So in your flu season down here in Australia.
Correct.
Right? So in Europe, we're not getting vaccinated for that H3 right now.
No. You've got the old vaccine, but there's a study put out through Public Health England that have looked at the early vaccine effectiveness of the vaccine being used in the UK, and it looks pretty good still. I think what we see is always a bit of doom and gloom on these things and try and make these predictions and want to update things all the time. But sometimes when you look back at these, things are not as dire as you might think. So that initial data looks quite promising that the vaccine will still be very effective.
So Australians will be getting this H3 vaccine in February, March time?
Well, as it turns out, February, we may update that H3 to the latest version. Europe will be the first to get that vaccine if we update that. Swings and roundabouts, it is, swings and roundabouts.
Is one region or country at an advantage in the way this system works, just geographically, because of this timescale and the different seasons of flu around the world?
I wouldn't say so. I think the countries that are probably at a disadvantage, it's probably easier to mention those, and they're the ones in the tropics. And they'll have a mixture of northern and southern hemisphere viruses going through at any one time. So they're probably at the disadvantage. I think the more surveillance you do, the better you know what's happening in your own country. So the countries with better surveillance would have a better chance of having their say in the consultation and having their viruses assessed, which may make it more likely that they'll get a better match with the vaccine. But we do try to take a global view on things rather than selecting vaccines for a particular country. That doesn't really make sense. Influenza is a global virus. We really need to take attention to whatever's happening around the world.
Coming up, how the world got this global monitoring system for influenza, and is it working?
British politics is failing. From the castration of state capacity to the shortage of human capital in our political parties, not much is working. The country and its people are in debt. Your wage is worth less.
The last time housing was this expensive, cars hadn't even been invented. 50 years ago, the most common living arrangement for young men was with their spouse. Now, it's with their parents.
The social contract is broken. And if people aren't apathetic, they're angry.
That's why we're here. Daily Politics from The New Statesman is your can't-miss guide to the inside view of politics.
I'm Ollie Dugmore.
I'm Anoosh Chakelian.
And every day we speak to our reporters, writers and experts to help you understand what's really going on in Westminster and beyond.
Is the radical right unbeatable?
Why is Keir Starmer failing?
And what's the left going to do about any of it?
Follow Daily Politics from The New Statesman on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen.
Welcome back. So Ian, let's talk about how this all started, this monitoring. So the first global monitoring system for influenza was set up by the WHO, the World Health Organization, in 1952. Tell me about that, how it was set up and why it was needed at that time.
Influenza was only discovered in the 1940s, so work done by Christopher Andrews and co. at Mill Hill in London were the first ones to identify the influenza virus. And things moved pretty rapidly in those days. There was early vaccines made in the late 1940s, and they were found to be effective for a short period of time, but then things changed and then they became not effective. WHO, had a lot of foresight in nominating a World Influenza Centre, as they called it then, in London at Mill Hill back in 1952 to try and monitor these influenza viruses and update them as required. But that network has grown rapidly over the years now, and now there's over something like 160 of these influenza centres. Not all of them have the same capabilities, but about 160 national influenza centres in about 130 different countries around the world. So it's a vast network now, and it's the longest continuous running program at WHO. So our centre in Melbourne was a designated centre by WHO back in the 50s, as a matter of fact, but not as a collaborating centre, as a reference centre in its infancy at a different location. And then in 1992, this centre became a collaborating centre.
What's different about it being a collaborating centre?
Well, a collaborating centre has a much broader remit than a reference centre. So the old reference centre looked at Australian viruses, or probably more likely Victorian viruses, so just state-based or national-based. Whereas a collaborating centre, we have a remit for the whole region here, Australia, New Zealand, the Oceania, as well as Southeast Asia. So a much wider remit and a much larger task now in terms of monitoring influenza and making vaccine recommendations, which was never part of the reference group. We rely a lot on the National Influenza Centres to provide samples, but there are many other laboratories around the world that supply samples, so I don't want to belittle their efforts either. The laboratories here in Australia, for example, are quite numerous that supply our samples, and we're very grateful for that. So, it is a really global exercise.
So, Ian, the system you've explained, it's been going on for more than 70 years. Is it working? Or do you sometimes just get the decision really wrong?
The system we currently have now is a lot more complex than it used to be. So, back in 1952, that was one lab reporting stuff and not much vaccine was made. So now in 2025, we have a much more sophisticated way of looking at things. We have a large group of people that analyze these data. We have a lot of computing power behind us now. Things have changed a lot in those times. So I think we're much better placed to track these viruses in the 2000s or in the last 5 or 10 years than we were back in the 20th century. So,
is there one year, an annus horribilis, that you all refer to in the influenza world where you really got it wrong?
Look, I think there's always surprises with influenza. Once you think you know everything about it, then you should get back in line because you don't. And look, we do our best. The virus is always changing, and when that changes, it doesn't go to a schedule. We are always challenged by the virus and its circulation. And what we're trying to do is best match our vaccine choices with the viruses that are going to circulate in 6 to 9 months. So that's a challenge. And while we don't always get it exactly right, usually there is some benefit for getting the vaccine, even if we get one of the viruses and not completely right.
Do you think there's another way to do it better?
Well, look, there are new ways of approaching vaccination. There's new developments out there. Some of them are getting quite close to being available. So the mRNA vaccines, even though some people shun away from mRNA vaccines, there's been a recent report that shows improved efficacy with an mRNA vaccine over a conventional vaccine. There are new medications, long-lasting medications that look very promising that have been developed in the US, where you have a one shot for the whole season, similar to a vaccine, but it's a long-lasting antiviral. So that looks exciting. Vaccines may not be the only answer, and people shouldn't forget the use of antivirals. So we have 2 different classes of antivirals that are available for use, either to prevent influenza infection or to treat influenza infections, which is the usual way of doing it. I think there are a number of different developments that are happening out there. So the conventional vaccines may not be the way we do things in 10 or 20 years' time. We may have alternatives.
Do you think you're having to deal with any increased level of misinformation or vaccine hesitancy in the post-COVID period?
In general, yes, that's true. So I think that's very evident when you look at the Australian vaccination rates for influenza. They've either reduced in most age groups or plateaued. And getting that message across each year is becoming more difficult. And that's not just for influenza vaccines, it's across the board for most vaccines. So I think the vaccine hesitancy story is certainly grown post-COVID and making life more difficult to convince people that vaccines are beneficial, and most of them have very few side effects.
The US Trump administration is preparing to pull out of the World Health Organization in early 2026. What challenges do you think that will bring for our global flu monitoring system and the work that you do?
Yeah, well, that remains to be seen what will happen after January 2026. Clearly, CDC is a big player in the global influenza world. They have provided resources to WHO and to various countries to improve their influenza and other virus detections over many decades. So they collect samples from right through North and South America currently and provide that data into the WHO system. They also have bilateral relationships with many countries around the world. So getting access to that data is important for us to make our decisions. So it remains to be seen how much they will be involved and how they will interact with WHO, but it would be a big loss if they were not able to contribute to the influenza surveillance program from WHO. And the other issue is putting this America First type approach and setting up these bilateral relationships sets up a sort of a dual system or an opposing surveillance system, which is not the optimal way of doing things, especially if that data is not easily accessible. WHO has spent decades building up this global network, and to have a parallel network would be a very backward move, in my opinion.
Well, thank you, Ian, for explaining it all to us. Appreciate it.
No problems. Cheers.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. You can read more about this year's flu season and the vaccination programmes against it on The Conversation, and we'll put some links to those in our show notes. This episode was written and produced by me, Gemma Ware, and Ment Marawani, with production assistance from Katie Flood and editing help from Ashlyn McGee. Mixing is by Michelle Macklem, and our theme music is by Nita Saul. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. And please also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Anna Walker, host of a new podcast called Jane Austen's Paper Trail from The Conversation. From a scandal-filled bun shop in Bath to a windswept walk along the Cobb in Lyme Regis, and even a glittering Regency ball, we've travelled around England to bring Jane Austen's world to life through interviews with today's foremost Austen experts. Listen to Jane Austen's Paper Trail wherever you get your podcasts.